welcome to this video tutorial on how to use Microsoft Excel pivot tables and pivot charts. The data model on screen is similar to ones shown in earlier videos. Let's take a moment to familiarize ourselves with the data model. I'll switch to diagram view to help us quickly grasp what we are looking at. As you can see, my source table is Northwind customer list. The table is linked to multiple related database tables. The source table has a relationship with the order list table. The relationship is indicated by a line linking company column to customer ID. The order list ID column links to the table order details column, and lastly the source table postcode column links to OX postcodes postcode column. The postcode link allows us to look up longitude and latitude. What I would like to show you is how we create a pivot table. I click the pivot table icon in the Home tab, arrowhead pointing down, and in the submenu I left click the pivot table option. Next, I'm asked whether I want to place the table in a data model worksheet or create a new worksheet. I prefer to create a new worksheet. It's worth pointing out we have access to all the pivot table tools. I click the Analysis tab and then the Design tab. Some of you might have noticed there are some additional choices under the Analysis tab. What is impressive is we are looking at the data from all my tables. Take a look at the Pivot Table Fields panel. I can expand the table by clicking the arrowhead pointing down to see the table columns. If I click on the table 1, I see the table columns listed from my source customer list table. The data is coming from the data model, as are the other data sources. Let's find out the number of last names. I click the last name tick box to place a tick. Then looking at the panel row section, I drag the column over to values. Immediately I can see the number of customers' last names. Let's suppose I want to look at customer postcodes in table 1. I left click to place a tick in the postcode box. That information isn't of great use, so I'll remove the tick and look for a postcode table. Expanding the OX postcodes table by left clicking the arrowhead pointing down, I place a tick in the counties box. Again, not particularly informative. Besides, some of you might have guessed OX stands for Oxford and there are no other counties listed in this table. Nevertheless, I'm sure you're beginning to see the possibilities. For example, I place a tick in the post town tick box. Immediately I can see how many customers are listed for a particular town or village in Oxfordshire. To expand a little further, I place a tick in postcode and county. To push things forward, I scroll down to the order table details and place a tick in the lookup to table product name. Next, I drag the column from the rows panel to the columns panel. Next, I scroll up to order list and place a tick in the order date. Again, I will drag the order date from rows to columns. If I had dates shown alphabetically rather than numerically, and I had a column for fiscal year, I could easily sort my dates accordingly. To finish up for this section, I will show you how to quickly add some color to the worksheet. Doing so may make it easier on the eye for most viewers viewing the pivot table. A word of warning, keep it simple. Too much color can be distracting and can confuse users. Given our objective is to help users quickly understand what information they need to focus on, it's in our interest to make it simple and quick to understand. I'll click the Design tab, then click the Pivot Table Stars arrow head. From there I select a layout I think my users will find beneficial. Remember, our personal preference is irrelevant, it's our users that matter, so choose wisely. One final point, take a look at the column label. If I make this my active selection, I can change the name to something more descriptive for users. For example, I can rename the column to product name. At this point I thought I would add a demo. The simple reason the data functions illustrated previously were not particularly motivating. However, we must start learning application functionality from the bottom up. But given my principal reason for producing these videos is to inspire you to use and explore Excel Power BI, I wouldn't be achieving my objective to get you using Excel BI if I didn't show you something that was informative. So let's take a look at a worksheet showing you something that's a little more informative. I'll switch to a worksheet I prepared earlier. To prepare this pivot table, I used all the methods I demonstrated to you earlier. If you look at the order list table, I have customer ID, order date, order total, tick boxes ticked. The postcode table, I removed the ticks. The table 1 table, I removed all the ticks. The order details table, I haven't any ticks either. While these tables' data hasn't been utilized on this occasion, they will be later on. Take a look in the rows panel and you'll see I have customer ID. Customer ID refers to company name. In the columns table, I have order date, month and order date. In the values panel, I have the sum of order. Now let's take a look at the pivot table. January, February and other months have a plus icon. I'll click that. You'll see some companies made a purchase in January. For example, company AA purchased a total of £1,705 of goods. If I take a look at the January grand total, I can see £4,096 of goods was sold. Looking at April, I can immediately see that company C was the best month's sales to date. At the grand total for January to June sales, I see sales exceed £1 million, largely thanks to company C. If I wanted to create a pivot table for company C and identify what products company C purchased and whether the customer is likely to want associated purchases in the near future, perhaps some purchases have an estimated product life cycle, and I should start marketing replacement goods prior to that likely date. The customer might be considering purchasing new product service. Of course, I could create a pivot table showing all the company's purchases rather than one company, but I do not wish to overload you with data. Besides, there is only so much screen real estate to allow us to observe and make sense of the data. Now you have an idea of how data can be manipulated to answer questions you might have. We can now move on. As you can see, I'm continuing to use the demo workbook. Looking at the pivot table fields panel under columns, I have order date, month and order date. I know the order list table and table order details contain date bound columns. If I filter or sort a table in Excel holding dates, the choices open to me are month, next month, year, today, last week, tomorrow, fiscal year. However, if I click the column label filters, I have label and value filters. I don't have filters for date. Power Pivot will accept months, names, numbers and years as values. The reason for this, Power Pivot isn't able to distinguish the column's values as dates. To rectify that, Excel needs to be told to treat date values as dates. To do that, I click the Power Pivot tab, if I'm not already in Power Pivot, and next I left click Manage. I look to the bottom to check the sheet I've opened. If I need to, I select the sheet I want to set dates for, in my case order details. Once the sheet selection is the active sheet, I click Design tab. Next, I click the Mark as Date table. I should mention, once you have clicked OK, you can't go back. I highly recommend you create backup copies prior to making such a change, just in case you later conclude you've made an error. Take a look at the message. You must select a column to be used as a unique identifier for the table. The selected column must be the data type, as you must contain unique values only. Unique values are a requirement to create a table relationship. If the data column doesn't hold unique values, you won't be able to proceed. Even if you could, you would experience an IT saying garbage in, garbage out, and that isn't of any value to anyone. I click OK and close the window. Reverting back to the pivot table and looking at it, all seems to be the same, but it has changed significantly. If I select the filter, I now have date filters available to me, such as day, week, month, year. I'm going to choose all dates in the period and choose February. Immediately I can see I have only made sales to 3 companies and probably not enough to cover my fixed costs for the month. Next, I repeat the previous steps and choose for the first quarter. Sales aren't fantastic. I repeat, and this time I choose April, a great month, but the company is reliant upon one company's purchases. Let's review what I've achieved here. The Mark Table Date feature has set the order list table to be date aware. If I had fiscal year, quarter, month, name, the date columns all would be available to me. This capability is very important and probably a feature you will use whenever you use pivot tables, as almost all databases will hold tables with a date column somewhere in order to help users make sense of the data. This section I will introduce you to slicers. Admittedly, elementary slicer functionality, but hopefully you will be inspired enough to play around with slicers yourself. As you can see, we are working with the same data, but I have set up a new pivot table named Sheet 2. The reason is to show you that you can have multiple pivot tables in a workbook, and I wanted to show company names, months and sales totals. Other than that, no changes. In the pivot fields panel, you can see in rows I have order date month, columns I have column ID, and for values field I have the sum of order. Looking at the table, you can see months, company name, for example company C. I have sales in February of 1,937, and for April a very healthy sales figure of almost £1 million. The table clearly displays data for users. However, imagine a manager wants to check sales for a particular company or a selected number of companies. Perhaps he or she wants to check particular salesperson's performance. The tool that will allow this sort of selection is called a slicer. I click the Power Pivot Tools Analyze tab and click the Insert Slicer icon. A window pops up and 2 tabs are listed. One is called the Active tab. This lists all the tables created in the pivot table that are available to me. If I click the All tab, this will list all the tables created in another pivot table sheet which has been created in the same workbook. For example, if you look below, you will see Sheet 1 pivot table. Sheet 1 pivot table may make use of database tables not used in Sheet 2 pivot table. The Insert Slicers All tab provides me with access to Sheet 1 and Sheet 2's tables. Active provides the table access to current pivot tables. That's the difference between Active and All. Let's create a slicer. I'm going to click Active tab, and in the Order List table I click Custom ID to place a tick and click OK. The slicer is added to the worksheet. I can reposition the slicer by left clicking and holding the button down and dragging the table to where I want to replace it. I only want to view Company C sales, so I click Company C. Almost instantly I'm shown the results. For a moment, let's add Company CC and AA. I press the Control key and hold it down while clicking the companies I want to add. Let's suppose I want to change the color of the slicer. I click the slicer tools, and under the slicer styles I can see choose the design that suits my users. The feature is useful if you have multiple slices to work with. So let's add another slicer. I click the Table to activate PivotTable tab, and under Analysis I click Insert Slicer. This time under Order List I click Employee ID. I click the Custom ID filter to remove previous settings. In the Employee ID I'm going to choose Christina Lee. It's easy to see Christine Lee links to Company D, and sales were made in January, February and April. Take a look at Customer ID and you'll see Company D is highlighted and the other companies are greyed out. The reason is entirely due to my choice selection. Watch what happens when I click John Edwards. The great thing about this tool is end users don't need to know anything about pivot table configuration and slices. With very simple instructions, users can clear filters and make their selections to suit their needs. For this section of the video, I'm going to cover Timeline Slicer. When you use date-based data, you will probably make this instrument one of your most frequently used tools. As you can see, we are continuing from the previous section. When we insert a timeline, we only have the choice of tables that have been formatted as date-based tables. You may recall an earlier video covering this topic. If you recall, to be able to make use of the date-based table, date times need to be unique. Let's add a timeline slicer. First, I will reset my slicer filters. Next, I click the Power Pivot Tool Analysis tab and simply click Insert Timeline icon. The window should be familiar to you if you viewed the previous section. You have two tabs, Active and All. I won't explain the difference as this was covered earlier. I click Order Date and leave Shipping Date without a tick. The slicer is added to the worksheet. I'll click the arrowhead pointing down and choose Year. Only the year 2006 is displayed. Let's switch to quarters. I only have 2 quarters of trading data to work with. I switch back to months. When I move the mouse cursor over the month display, notice the handles change. I hover over the beginning of April. Left click and hold the mouse button down and drag the handles over to March. As I do so, take a look at the table. Data is now displaying March figures as well as April. Let's for one moment say I only want to look at Company AA and Company C figures, and I want to know what months orders were sent. First, I click Filters for all slices. I click the table to give me access to Pivot Tools Analysis tab and click Insert Timeline. This time I click Shipping Table and click OK. The shipping slicer is added. I change the display from months to days. Next I double click Company AA and then C. I can see Company A ordered items in January and April. If I click the Shipping Timeline January block, I can see order was shipped in January, but what day? I'm going to assume towards the end of the month, so I'll click the 20th, then the 21st, and the 22nd. Ordinarily, I would reconfigure the pivot table to show dates rather than click slicer days. Suppose I want my timeline shipping slicer to stand out from other slicers. I can do so by setting a different color scheme. Like slicer, I simply click shipping to make that the active slicer, then click the timeline tools option tab and then choose a timeline style. If I wanted to rename the slicer, I can do so by clicking timeline caption and rename the slicer to something my users will find more appropriate. Let's say I didn't want a slicer header. I click the header tick box to remove the tick. If I didn't want users to be able to select quarters and months, I click the time level tick box to remove the tick. I can also remove section label and scroll bar if that's appropriate for my users by removing the ticks. In addition to Data Slicer, Timeline Slicer, we can create pivot charts. I hear you asking, what is a pivot chart? It's a graphical representation of data. However, a pivot chart allows users to easily manipulate the data to answer questions they may have with the data. There are a number of ways to create a chart. 1. Click the Insert tab and choose Insert Pivot Chart from the Chart section. The chart that you are presented with is the recommended chart. If I were to click the recommended chart icon, I will see the same choice. If I wish to select another type of chart, I can, of course, ignore the recommended chart and choose one that suits my requirements. The second method, I click Pivot Tools, and under the Analysis tab, I choose Pivot Chart. Again, not surprisingly, the recommendation is the same. I don't need to use either. I could, under the Insert tab, Chart section, make a choice from clicking a chart icon of my choice. I'm going to accept the recommended choice. The chart is inserted into the worksheet. If I click the plus sign on the top right hand side of the chart, I can change chart elements. For example, I can remove the legend. The fields buttons, for example customer ID, work as filters. Let's suppose I don't wish users to be able to use filters. I can turn them off by clicking the Show Hide Field icon, and in the drop down click Hide All. This makes it a chart only. If I wanted to change the design, I click the brush icon to the right of the chart. In the side window I can change both the accent color scheme and the chart style. If the data represented a single company, then only one color would be applied to the chart. I can reposition the chart, change the name of the chart. The chart is skewed by Company C's spectacular April sales results. I'm going to remove Company C from the chart. I click the Customer ID and click Company A, AA and BB. Note how the chart changes to represent the user's choice. Next I choose Order Date Months to show January to June, and then the Delivery Date Time Slicer. I switch to Months and then select January to June. Again the chart changes. If different attributes were needed, I can add additional slices. All very slick, but this is where it ends for pivot charts. You and I are moving on to explore other BI tools. You may want to learn more, and if that's the case, I suggest you take a look at Microsoft Virtual Academy and Microsoft Channel 9. There are other training providers.